since President Biden was sworn into office. So I thought I'd focus my prepared remarks today on first, Beijing's current approach to the United States, my take on President Biden's approach so far toward China, and what it all means for the U.S. business community. And I'll close with a couple of thoughts about the mindset that I believe America should adopt as a government and as a people to ensure that we win the competition against Beijing's vision for a predominantly authoritarian world. It's a competition that we very much can and very much must win. And I'll try to be succinct so that we have plenty of time for a lively discussion. So what's Beijing's approach? In the weeks that surrounded President Biden's inauguration, Chinese leaders waged an information campaign aimed at the United States. The flurry of speeches and letters and announcements was not, as news reporters first assumed, addressed mainly at the new administration in Washington. It was actually an influence operation targeting the U.S. business community. The Communist Party's top diplomat, Yang Jiechi, spoke to a virtual audience of American business leaders and former officials in early February, and he painted a rosy picture of investment and trade opportunities in China before warning that Tibet and Xinjiang, where human rights atrocities are underway, Hong Kong, where the rule of law is being dismantled, and Taiwan, which Beijing has threatened to annex by force, are, quote, red lines, close quote. He made clear that Americans of all walks of life would do well to keep their mouths shut about these issues. Yang excoriated Trump administration policies towards China, and he was unsubtle in pressing his audience to lobby the Biden administration to reverse them. Other senior Chinese diplomats made similar statements aimed at U.S. business people. And General Secretary Xi Jinping, seated before a mural of the Great Wall of China, beamed himself to business elites in Davos in late January. He used his speech to enlist their support in resisting efforts by European and American policymakers to decouple segments of their economies from China's. General Secretary Xi even wrote a personal letter to a prominent U.S. businessman exhorting him to, quote, make active efforts to promote China-U.S. economic and trade cooperation. Now, in order to make clear that these were requirements by Beijing and not mere suggestions, Beijing squirted a shot of vinegar in the form of sanctions that it announced on nearly 30 current or former U.S. government officials. And these were on top of sanctions that Beijing had already placed on American human rights activists, pro-democracy foundations, and some United States senators last year. So Beijing's intended message is, if you want to do business in China, it must be at the expense of American values. You must meticulously ignore atrocities inside China's borders. You must disregard that Beijing has reneged on its major promises, including its international treaty guaranteeing Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy. And you must stop engaging with national security-minded officials in your own capital, unless it's to lobby them on Beijing's behalf. So this unmistakable ultimatum from Beijing is you have to choose. You have to choose. Now, there's another notable element in Beijing's approach to its, and that's really its explicit aspiration to make the world permanently dependent on China's manufacturing base, even as Beijing pursues independence from high-tech exports by European and American companies. So in other words, decoupling is precisely Beijing's strategy, so long as it's entirely on Beijing's terms. Beijing also has a deliberate strategy to remain the largest market for fungible commodities. So just let that sink in for a minute. China's top leader has stated plainly that he's pursuing a grand strategy of making China independent of high-tech goods and services from advanced industrialized countries, while simultaneously making those same countries heavily reliant on China for its high-tech supplies, for their high-tech supplies, and also as a market for commodities. So what's even more remarkable is that the Communist Party is no longer hiding why it is pursuing this strategy. In a speech that Xi delivered early last year, but published only in November in the party's leading theoretical journal, Xi said that China, quote, must tighten international production chains' dependence on China, with the aim of forming powerful countermeasures and deterrent capabilities. So this phrase, powerful countermeasures and deterrent capabilities, is Communist Party jargon for offensive leverage. So Beijing's grand strategy is to accumulate and exert economic leverage to coerce its political, people into adopting its political aims around the world. And I'll give you a recent example of that. After cultivating very significant trade volumes with Australia over the years, Beijing last year suddenly began restricting imports of Australian wine, beef, and barley for purely political aims. Beijing released a list of 14 quote-unquote disputes. In actuality, it was a list of political demands of the Australian government. And the demands included Australia having to roll back its laws designed to counter China's covert influence operations in Australian politics and society. And it also included a demand that Australia muzzle Australia's free press to prevent it from publishing news articles that are critical of the regime in Beijing. So Australia's travails are really just a foretaste of what Beijing has in store for all of us if we fail to rise to the challenge. Now, what about Washington's approach to China? President Biden last week published his interim national security strategic guidance. So this is a 24-page document summarizing President Biden's priorities. And the document makes clear that as far as challenges to the United States go, China is really in a category by itself. It is, quote, the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system, that document states. Secretary of State Tony Blinken, in his first major address, which was timed for the release of this strategic guidance, went further, describing the relationship with China as, quote, the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. And Secretary Blinken said that, quote, our relationship with China will be competitive when it should, be collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must. He went out of his way to differentiate the Biden administration's approach from the softer policy of the Obama years. But most striking of all, I think, about that document is the degree to which it casts the U.S.-China competition in ideological terms. So the document dwells on this theme quite a bit. In his signed letter introducing the document, President Biden said, quote, I believe we are in the midst of a historic and fundamental debate about the future direction of our world. There are those who argue that given all the challenges we face, autocracy is the best way forward. And we must prove that our model isn't a relic of history. It's the single best way to realize the promise of our future. So that quote, when you really think about Beijing's dirty little secret, which is that Xi Jinping has been describing the competition with the United States in precisely such ideological terms for years in his internal speeches. If you take, for example, a key passage from General Secretary Xi's seminal speech, which was kept secret for 6 years, but which he delivered to the Communist Party Central Committee on the 5th of January, 2013. He said, quote, there are people who believe that communism is an unattainable hope, or even that it is beyond hoping for, that communism is an illusion. Facts have repeatedly told us that Marx and Engels' analysis of the basic contradictions in capitalist society is not outdated, nor is the historical materialist view that capitalism is bound to die out and socialism is bound to win. This is an inevitable trend in social and historical development, but the road is tortuous. The eventual demise of capitalism and the ultimate victory of socialism will require a long historical process to reach conclusion, close quote. So the Biden and the Xi quotations are almost mirror images of each other. And President Biden's quotation is, in effect, kind of a belated American rejoinder to Xi Jinping's secret call for the defeat of capitalism and democracy. And Xi made that speech during President Obama's first term. So we're catching up to where Beijing has already been for quite some time now. American intellectuals and business lobbies have long resisted casting U.S.-China relations as an ideological struggle. President Biden's guidance, like Xi Jinping's, makes clear, however, that as far as policy is concerned, this matter is already settled. The ideological dimension of the competition with China is inescapable, and it might actually even be central. President Biden's guidance also signals that while his tactics are going to deviate from the Trump administration's, there's so far a significant degree of continuity in U.S. strategy. And I think that's reflective of the bipartisan consensus on China that finally emerged over the past few years. So it's no wonder then that Beijing is focusing its influence activities on other segments of American society, the U.S. business community in particular, but also state and local governments here in the United States. Beijing knows that its influence efforts at the federal level are increasingly in vain. For the first time in decades, Chinese diplomats are facing resolve rather than accommodation on Capitol Hill and in two successive administrations in the White House. So what should American CEOs do about that? First, I think they need to come to grips with how much the situation has changed over the past few years, and that this change seems unlikely to be rolled back. CEOs are going to find it increasingly difficult to please Washington and Beijing at the same time. President Biden's strategic guidance flatly states that, quote, "We will ensure that U.S. companies do not sacrifice American values in doing business in China," close quote. Meanwhile, Chinese leaders, as I mentioned at the start, are really issuing high decibel warnings to multinationals that Western values are unwelcome if companies want to do business in China. So like sailors straddling two boats, American companies are likely to get wet. And one prudent step for CEOs to take would be reviews of how the new geopolitical reality impacts their corporate enterprise risk management on both sides of the Pacific. And the great power competition with China has really introduced a thicket of new regulatory, fiduciary, and reputational risks that corporations here are only just beginning to wake up to. Beijing's intensifying use of extrajudicial tools also add a layer of personal security risk that companies need to weigh more heavily. Beijing's taking as hostages two Canadian businessmen, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, is a good case in point. But another prudent step would be to draw up contingencies for diversifying supply chains. The rush to concentrate so much of the world's manufacturing on the east coast of the People's Republic of China in recent decades really was an aberration, and it was an unsustainable one. Now, no one in Washington is seriously threatening a wholesale decoupling of the two economies. That's a straw man argument put forward mainly by Chinese propagandists and a handful of alarmists here at home. But decoupling in a more limited variety, particularly on key technologies, is already well underway. In the Trump administration, we've referred to this as selective decoupling. And I've noticed that some Biden administration officials use the term managed decoupling. Senator Tom Cotton and some others on Capitol Hill have adopted the term targeted decoupling. So when you have so many different voices using such similar terminology, it's a sign that CEOs need to pay attention. Now, I said I'd close my remarks with a comment about the mindset that I think we need to adopt in order for American democracy to pass the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century, as Secretary Blinken put it. A favorite metaphor in Beijing and in Washington is that our two countries are running in a marathon, and only one contestant is going to prevail above all the others. And it's a fine metaphor. But let me submit that right now, we're actually in a 400-meter dash that we must win in order to qualify for the next leg of the marathon. If over the next 4 years we fail to set the right conditions with bold affirmative policies, we could put ourselves on track to lose the marathon, though we might not realize it until several years down the road. So above all, that's going to require us to consider in every policy we adopt, every bill we introduce, and every public-private partnership that government and U.S. industry undertake, we have to consider whether each initiative increases American leverage in this competition or surrenders leverage to a hostile dictatorship in Beijing. The balance of the leverage, we should never forget, is heavily in our favor. It's really up to us to keep it that way. And Beijing knows that it's in a sprint right now, too. It knows better than anyone else that the advantages of a centrally planned system are fleeting. and that the economic shortcomings of such a system, including waste, bureaucratic inertia, and the unforgivingly magnified consequences of each miscalculation, will start to show before too long, if they aren't showing already. So Beijing is really trying to engineer victory in the mind of a single leader, while free societies like ours, by contrast, harness the human spirit. And therein lies our advantage. So thanks for letting me make those opening remarks, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Matt, for those great remarks. Now we turn to the discussion portion of our program. Elizabeth Economy is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is widely acclaimed as an expert on China's domestic and foreign policy and has published too many to count articles and books on those subjects, including in 2018, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping, and the New Chinese State. H.R. McMaster is the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Bernard and Susan Leotold Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University, as well as a lecturer at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He was the 26th National Security Advisor to the President and served a distinguished 34-year career in the U.S. Army before retiring at the rank of Lieutenant General. And somehow he also found time in there to be a history professor. So Liz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenn. And let me add my welcome to you, Matt, because it's really just terrific to have you join us here at Hoover as a visiting distinguished fellow. So you and HR, of course, as well, when he was National Security Advisor, I think really affected a reset of our China policy. People talk about resetting the Russia policy, but you guys, without using that word, actually reset it. And I want to come back throughout our discussion to talk about what you think you did right, what you maybe missed or would have done differently, what you would still like to do. But just because Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan appears they're going to meet next week with Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, let me start, since you talked a little bit about the Biden administration, with asking you, what is it that you think they want to get accomplished in this first meeting, or what should they try to get accomplished in this first meeting, just 2 months after they've come into office?
Yeah, so that's a good question for them. I would say that that a meeting like this early in the administration, at a time when it's very clear that our attempts to engage with Beijing have been fruitless for so long. I would use a meeting like this simply to set the terms of engagement going forward. In other words, rather than have it be a particularly substantive agenda, to basically say these are the things that need to be addressed for us to have a substantive agenda. And there's a pretty long list of grievances on our side, I think, that would need to be addressed. I haven't seen any indication from Beijing, either over the course of the 4 years of the Trump administration or in the first 50 days of the Biden administration, that they intend to change their course in any way in order to have better relations with the United States. And so I think their actions speak loudly, and we should be judging based on their actions.
So let me just quickly ask before I give HR his first turn. Otherwise, I'll just monopolize the entire conversation. So let me just, what would those maybe 2 or 3 terms that you sort of suggest, what would they look like if you were sitting in their seat right now? What would you want to get out of the meeting?
Well, for starters, we've got several Americans who are being held hostage in China. These are American citizens who've committed no crime in China, but who have been put under what's euphemistically called an exit ban. In other words, they're trapped in China. In some cases, they're trapped in hotels in China because Beijing wants to use them as collateral to force relatives, in some cases distant relatives, to come back and face the party security apparatus. I would start with the release of American hostages. I would also ask for the release of Canadian hostages, Michael Spavor, Michael Kovrig, who I mentioned, who are being held literally as human collateral. Neither of them have committed anything even nominally approximating a crime or misdemeanor in China. I would certainly start there. I think there's a long list of other things that we would lay out. Remember, I mentioned that China just laid out a 14-point set of demands to the Australian government. Maybe the United States should have its own list of 14 disputes or 14 demands.
With massive investment cover for a lot of their poor economic decisions they take to advance their strategic interests. So I'll just point out that foreign direct investment in China exceeded that of foreign direct investment in the United States, for example, just in recent months. Would you comment on that? And how do you see Wall Street's perception of China? What has to change? And do you think it's possible to adjust kind of the incentives that are driving these massive investments in China?
No, it's a great question. There's no doubt that Wall Street right now is an outlier in the United States. It's a big outlier, and a consequential one, but it is an outlier. When you've got a consensus, it might be the only consensus we have in Washington, D.C., between both parties in both the executive branch and in the legislature, that we've got a major problem with China and that we've got to be bringing a whole of society approach to combating Beijing's aspirations. It says that all of this passive investment that's taking place in the form of index funds and things like that, where Wall Street is basically taking the passive pension savings of unsuspecting Americans and funneling them by the hundreds of billions of dollars into companies, including Chinese military affiliated companies, including Chinese companies that have been sanctioned by the U.S. government for human rights violations, including the concentration camps in Xinjiang. It's a sign that there's something amiss there. And so what we tried to begin doing under the Trump administration was to start, as you put it, to realign the incentives and the disincentives. The National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, and the National Economic Counselor, Larry Kudlow, wrote a joint letter last year, first to the Federal Pension Board that manages the pensions of federal workers and U.S. Marines and sailors and airmen, and said, why is it that you are about to shift our military members' money into Chinese military companies that are developing the capabilities to kill those same pensioners? and that led to a suspension by the Thrift Savings Plan Board. They suspended their plans to go forward with investing in China. The next step that was taken was 2 executive orders by President Trump to say that American U.S. persons can no longer invest and actually are required to divest from a blacklist of Department of Defense designated companies that are affiliated with or controlled by the People's Liberation Army, along with their subsidiaries. So right now, that policy is under review by the Biden administration. I certainly hope they continue with it. This is a really critical area where we've got a massive advantage. There is no capital market in the world that comes close to the weight of the U.S. market. The U.S. capital markets are more than the rest of the world's combined, including Shanghai and Shenzhen and Hong Kong, for that matter. So Beijing is using this loophole to pull passive money unsuspectingly from pension funds through these complicit index funds to as you put it, compensate for the very serious problems with their economic system.
You're muted.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, I'd like to make just one last question to both Liz and to Matt. There's been some speculation that China will try to entice the United States. The Chinese Communist Party officials will, with the promise of cooperation on really important global issues associated with climate change, for example. Liz, you've done the seminal work really on China and pollution and their environmental policies or lack thereof. And I'd like to just ask you what your assessment is, Liz, and then Matt, if you would comment on that as well. Is there an element of your advice to the administration of do not fall for it being false promises of cooperation in areas they know we care about, that could result in us really vacating some of the competitive space that we've just recently re-entered?
I'll be quick and say, look, I hope we can find some areas of genuine cooperation. If we can, both agree that we should be supporting, green technology in Africa as opposed to China's export of coal-fired power plants, I'm all for that. What I am not in favor of is any sign that we would trade out on other critical issues in order to somehow garner cooperation on climate change. I mean, Xi Jinping has presented himself as a leader, right, on global climate change. He stood up there and said, we are the defenders, because let's just acknowledge the fact that the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement or started the process, which in my opinion was a mistake, but one of the few that it made with regard to our standing there. But I'm just not, I don't want to see us, make that kind of mistake. China needs to do the right thing because it is the right thing. And if it doesn't do the right thing, then we should bring the pressure to bear from the international community and shame it into doing the right thing. So no trading off on other issues, but I'm not opposed to trying. That's kind of how I would divide up the cooperative competitive element.
Yeah, and you're right, Liz, and I agree with you. The thing that I would add as a cautionary note, because we all hope for areas of genuine cooperation with China, but a couple of concrete examples I'll give you that should make us skeptical and require China to have to prove that it's changed its tune, which I'm quite skeptical of. One is that early in the administration, in the Trump administration, I tried to work with the Chinese government on pandemic prevention. We weren't thinking specifically about another coronavirus necessarily. We were thinking more along the lines of influenza, and found that China was not living up to the international health regulations that they're required to abide by as a member of the World Health Organization. They're supposed to share samples. Remember, most of these new flu samples traditionally have emerged from southern Chinese farms. And so they have to share these new flu samples so that the WHO and the rest of the WHO members are able to prepare and analyze those samples and their genomes. China was unwilling to share those samples. And I got the distinct feeling over time that they didn't want to share them precisely because they wanted to withhold it as leverage to gain political advantage on wholly unrelated topics, things unrelated to public health and the safety of billions of people. And so I would give as a second example a story that broke in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. And it was really building on a story that came out of the German Marshall Fund earlier than that Russia, China, and Iran, their security apparatuses and propaganda apparatuses are deliberately generating and amplifying storylines around the world designed to undermine people's faith in the efficacy and safety of U.S. vaccines for COVID. So this is the Chinese government is doing that. It's not just some quack. It's the government, and Russia's taken the lead on that. China has happily amplified those narratives. So that's yesterday. So I mean, how much cooperation are we really going to expect when Beijing is deliberately willing to put millions of lives at risk by undermining people's faith in vaccines?
Thanks. Okay, Glenn, over to you and our audience.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, that was really depressing. Thank you, Matt. By the way, my one small, area. So let's talk about another potentially, a really serious issue, which is Taiwan. And I think, watching what's happened in Hong Kong over the past year or more, it's just been devastating. I think for all of us, and certainly I think shines a brighter light on the potential, of China to take some pretty serious action against Taiwan in the not too distant future. And I'm wondering what you think the United States ought to do at this point with regard to Taiwan. There have been a lot of discussions. Should we have strategic ambiguity? Should we go for greater clarity? What should be the level of our commitment? How do we engage our allies? What's your sort of thinking about, strategically about how the United States should be, assisting Taiwan at this point?
Yeah, no, I think it's something we should certainly be looking at in coordination with Taiwan. The question of how we would respond and under what circumstances. But if you put that debate about strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity aside for a second, it's important to remember that the U.S. has always responded when there is a strategic threat of coercion and military coercion of Taiwan. In 1947, 1950, 51, 1957, 58, 1995, 96. And so it would be a historic aberration were the United States not to come to Taiwan's defense in the event that Beijing attacked or tried to blockade or take some other coercive step. Yeah.
Okay, but let me just push a little bit more. I mean, what Chinese military capabilities are growing in the region, and people are talking about potential for a massive cyber attack. What do you see if you'd like the three steps that the United States should take now? Maybe things we aren't doing, things that you wanted to do to bolster. Yeah.
Substantive support is even more important than symbolic support at this stage, and that means helping Taiwan upgrade its defensive concepts, the way that it's organized, its forces, the way that it's organized, also its entire society. Because one thing that Beijing needs to bear in mind, in Beijing's fantasy. A war over Taiwan would be something that would take place very quickly. It would be a fait accompli that would take a matter of days, maybe a couple of weeks at the outset, before the United States and others in the region were able to mount an effective defense. That's the theory that they're playing with. If Taiwan society as a whole has demonstrated that it has the will, not just the military forces, active duty, but reservists, civil defense, and others have the will to fight for every village and every block of every city and every mountaintop, that is going to require Beijing to revisit a lot of its strategic assumptions about what a war would actually look like. It could be a devastating quagmire for the Chinese Communist Party. In any case, I wouldn't make the assumption that they're making that it would be quick. But things that the United States can do to help support Taiwan in its reorganization, its armaments. They need ammunition. They need to have stockpiles of advanced missiles and other weaponry, so that Beijing doesn't think that they won't be able to be resupplied. They're already going to have the supplies that they need to fight a tough, grinding, long-term conflict if it comes to that, which we certainly hope it won't.
Thank you, Liz and HR, for those very stimulating discussion. I want to give the audience a chance now to have its questions raised. And in particular, I want to pick a question from the audience that connects with what we were just talking about with regards to Taiwan, but certainly exceeds the scope of Taiwan. And that is, what do you think the ability of the Biden administration now is to forge closer transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliances so that we can form a more common approach to China, not just say in a security framework like the Quad or in a democracy framework like the talked about D10, but more broadly. Now that China's strength has grown relative to the United States, the costs of antagonizing China like, and from your perspective, what do you think the most effective way forward should be?
Do you want me to field that?
Or? Yeah, Matt.
Yes, please, Matt.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, it's interesting when I was working on the NSC staff for H.R. McMaster and then John Bolton and Robert O'Brien after him, we progressively reorganized the NSC so that there were people responsible for every region of the world in the context of our competition with China. So for Europe, for Latin America, for the Middle East, and Africa, there were China experts who were engaging with our partners on all of those continents and all of those regions to ensure that they understood what our assumptions were, that they had the benefit of the knowledge of all of the processes that we went through in crafting our own strategy, so that as those countries began to consider strategies of their own, and they did, many of them followed suit with their own strategies. Europe in early 2019 put out that rather stunning statement that China is, they've recognized for the first time, as a systemic rival of Europe, and that it's putting forward alternative models of governance, totalitarian governance. So for several years now, we've had very good working relations with our partners in Europe up to a pretty senior level, talking about the things that we need to do together. I think that the closer you get to the grassroots, when you really get to the people and popular opinion in Europe, the more you see alignment with U.S. policy and assumptions, and also with the sorts of steps that they believe that we need to undertake, even if some of them are costly. They're not going to be nearly as costly as people fear, frankly. We proved that during the Trump administration. But it's when you get into the stratosphere of business lobbies with very senior bureaucrats who are used to, in fact, they have the muscle memory of helping promote closer trade and investment ties with China over the last 25 years. That's where you see some static, and frankly, those bureaucrats and even elected officials are out of tune and out of step with their own people. If you talk to members of the European Parliament, you hear a very different story that's much more akin to everything that we're talking about today about China than you hear sometimes in the trade ministries and finance ministries of some of these countries. Europe is coming in the same direction that we are already. They're about 18 to 24 months behind us, but they're moving in the same direction, same heading, same speed. So I think there's a huge opportunity for the Biden administration to keep leading on that front. And it should lead. Sometimes leading means that you're out ahead of the group. If you wait to hold hands with everybody in lockstep and jump together, you may not make that big of a splash. Sometimes you have to get out in front. Europe will follow. They are following. And I think it'll be useful for that to be borne in mind.
Thank you, Matt. Just last week, I think the National Security Commission on AI issued a very important report led by Eric Schmidt, formerly of Google. I wonder if you could comment on the U.S. technological competition with China and the challenges China poses to U.S. national security and economic leadership in this domain, not just priorities for U.S. policy would be going forward.
Yeah. So, with 5G is a useful example to talk about, because we woke up late to the whole idea. We were very complacent, happy with our 4G phones, and our telecom networks were making good money without having to invest in future sorts of technologies. And we woke up late to the fact that Huawei, which had benefited from intellectual property that had obtained through their various means, I refer you to the Department of Justice on that, and also through about $120 billion, according to the Wall Street Journal, in subsidies from the Chinese state, had gone out ahead and almost made the idea of a world dominated by Huawei and 5G networks a fait accompli. We weren't willing to accept that fait accompli, and so we took steps along with our allies to make sure that Chinese telecom makers did not have access to our networks in 5G. Because of the national security implications. Remember, what they're really after at the end of the day is not just market share. They're after our data. They want access to our most sensitive corporate, government, and personal data. That's what this is all about. That's why the subsidies have been flowing to these companies. So we took those defensive steps. We educated our partners and allies. In cases where partners and allies were slow to come around, we went a step further with the Commerce Department last year when we put forward 2 rules that basically banned American semiconductors and semiconductor technology from being purchasable, even indirectly, by Chinese telecoms makers. That ended up completely changing the dynamic. It seized the initiative. It forced this supposedly unstoppable behemoth national champion of China into a defensive crouch. And it's actually now creating incentives for the market to reassert itself. The market had been kneecapped by this very non-market set of factors that were at play. Now the market is starting to reassert itself. You're seeing investment in equipment manufacturing again. There's a lot more that we need to do to spice up those incentives. And then in the area of software, we're already ahead. Even on 5G, we're well ahead of Huawei. If you crack open a piece of radio access network gear from Huawei, 93% of the components are from Europe, the United States, and Japan. Okay, so it's not that we don't have the technology or that they've figured out technological advances. They have not. What they've done is they've marshaled all of the elements of state power to put this into sort of a vertical stack, and then to go out and lend money at non-commercial rates to foreign governments to require them to buy Chinese gear. So that's what this is about. We now need to replicate that model in semiconductors, machine learning, and AI. We certainly can't cede any ground on quantum and on our significant edge on quantum. In the genetics and biotech space, same thing. They have a similar project and approach that Huawei took. That China has a state champion that comes in and tries to heavily subsidize their genetic sequencing devices from being used, because ultimately, again, they don't just want market share for the sake of commercial market share. They want the genetic data from every human population around the world so that they can have advances and monopolize gene therapy drugs and also to use for more nefarious purposes.
Thanks. One of the problems that arises in confronting China and defending the United States' national interests vis-a-vis China, but also Russia, is this notion of gray zone competition, that we're not competing in the traditional terms of military to military competition, but now there's an entire sphere of asymmetrical warfare and areas of competition that don't respond to more traditional deterrence theory. Defending forward seem to be doing very, very well. But in the last several months, the United States has been slammed by a series of massive cyber attacks, in particular, of course, the SolarWinds hack, but much more recently, the presumptively or attributed attack by China on Microsoft Exchange services. What do you think U.S. policy should be and the response should be to those most recent attacks? And do you think any adjustments with respect to deterrence and defending forward are called for going forward?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The one step that the Obama administration took at the end of his time in office, I think it was in 2015, President Obama and his team got fed up with many of the Chinese cyber hacks in particular. And so he signed an executive order which gave him the authority to sanction Chinese companies that benefit from the theft of stolen American intellectual property. I think that was a very good move. That executive order has never been exercised. The Trump administration took other steps in the form of, we took, hundreds of steps designed to impose costs on China, including indicting, and in some cases jointly indicting with 12 other countries, announcing indictments of specific companies and actors that were involved in Chinese cyber penetrations of our networks. But we haven't used the President Obama's EO to actually impose costs on China's economic actors, not just the security apparatus that's stealing, but the companies that have benefited from the fruits of that theft. I think that that's an important area where we need to get really aggressive, and we need to get really coordinated with our Indo-Pacific allies, as well as our European and other North American friends and partners.
Thanks. We have a question coming in regarding U.S. academic cooperation with China. The Trump administration has certainly put a focus on the challenges that U.S. universities and our research enterprise in general face when coping with China, particularly because it has a state-directed policy of technology transfer and is very assertively trying to dominate particular fields in which the U.S. has established leadership. What do you think U.S. policy towards managing academic exchanges with China should be? Have we struck the right balance? And in particular, another questioner asks, how has this changed the larger atmospherics for Asian Americans and Chinese Americans in the United States who are feeling anti-Asian discrimination and some blowback from the measures that Congress and the executive have taken to confront China and to compete more effectively against China? How do we strike the right balance in both of those spheres?
Yeah, those are great questions. Starting with the last one first, we took great care to always differentiate between the regime on the one hand, and the Chinese people, the Chinese nation, Chinese culture, Chinese history, on the other hand. We view all of the latter category as our allies in this competition, not our adversaries. And so when discrimination appears, I've read about cases recently, we have to call it out loudly. And beat it back. That is, and I would say that Beijing has rather cynically tried to play up those divisions, or even foment that kind of discrimination in our society. We've got to call that out as well. Just cast a bright, hot spotlight on it, and not allow people, including Beijing, to conflate the idea of Chinese Americans or the Chinese people who are Chinese nationals as being somehow the target of our ire. They are not. When we looked at the problem of researchers who were there in our labs, clearly for the wrong reasons, we decided to take a step that narrowly, surgically, made it more difficult for researchers from a certain pedigree, PLA-affiliated researchers that are affiliated with PLA research universities that have shown a long pattern of sort of malign influence and intent to steal intellectual property. Also, Chinese researchers who are obligated by contract to the Chinese government to bring back all of their intellectual property. Many have signed those contracts under the terms of some of their talent recruitment programs and some of their scholarship programs. And so we very carefully analyzed all of that, worked with FBI and our intelligence community, the Department of Defense, and also with the academic community to adopt a policy that probably removed about 1% of the students. And remember, China is the largest. About half of the foreign students in the United States are from China. 370,000 at the undergraduate and above level, another 70 or 80,000 at the high school level. It was only a few thousand out of that 450,000 who were no longer welcome to apply for U.S. visas or to be granted U.S. visas under the policy that we undertook. Now, I point to another statistic, and I saw this with the Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice, who handles national security matters, made a comment the other day that when the United States Department of Justice made arrests of a handful of Chinese researchers who were here under false pretenses, false identity. They were actually PLA-affiliated researchers working in sensitive labs, but they had not disclosed that as they were supposed to. When we made those arrests and also closed down the Houston consulate, where there were a lot of malign activities taking place, China proactively withdrew, according to the Department of Justice, about 1,000 more of its undercover researchers. So it shows you that taking proactive steps, accepting a certain amount of risk in the U.S.-China relationship is something that's worth doing. It actually forces China to go onto the defensive and not to have such an easy, complacent time putting malign actors, which are a small minority, into our labs.
You know, at the federal level, the Trump administration and under your leadership and Congress have both done a great deal to raise consciousness about the challenges that engagement with China poses and about recalibrating the new terms of engagement with China. But what needs to be done at the state and local level still? Is that the weak underbelly of the United States? Wonder what you think the priorities should be there.
Yeah, well, Beijing thinks it's the weak underbelly. That's why they've organized their embassies and consulates to have a very significant portion of their staff focused on what they call subnational affairs. We don't really have an equivalent for that in our embassy in Beijing. Our diplomats aren't even granted very much access to Chinese companies and universities anymore. There are even whole provinces that they're not allowed to visit. Meanwhile, China's task organized called United Front work influence city governments and legislatures at the state level and governors' offices to try to undermine or create incentives that are at odds with the federal consensus that I described in my set remarks. Beijing is going to try to do this all the more because they're having such a hard time advancing their policies on Capitol Hill in Washington or in the West Wing in Washington. But it really requires some kind of proactive education. Those kinds of activities were undertaken. I know that Senator Warner did a lot of great work in partnership with Bill Evanina, who was our top counterintelligence officer. They were traveling around the country talking to business leaders, which is the other soft underbelly, as we've discussed, but also with state and local officials. That kind of activity needs to be more systematized and more routine.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, HR, and thank you, Liz, for really wide-ranging and very, very rich discussion. I would be remiss if I didn't invite all of you in the audience to attend our next speaker event in the CGSP Speaker Series. That will be on April 13th at 9 a.m. Pacific. Sarah Cook, Research Director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House, will be previewing her path-breaking work on China's battle for global public opinion and media influence. Thank you very much for joining us today. And for those of you who did not catch all of it, this will be up on YouTube in a few days. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.